Few versus Scott Drew to open up the season in Sin City. Sign me up.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. All right, folks, we are discussing Gonzaga's latest scheduling rumor. I guess it's a rumor. It sounds like it's just hasn't been publicized yet. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to take a look at Gonzaga's non-conference as a whole. We did this last week with Arizona State being added to the schedule. We're going to take a look at it now with another new game on the schedule, what might be coming up with 3 more games left to be scheduled. Close the show talking about Jalen Suggs being an extension candidate for the Orlando Magic, what that might mean for him, and taking a look at Washington State's first official non-conference schedule after the demise of the Pac-12, what it might mean for the Cougars going forward. All that jam-packed, fun episode here of Locked On Zags. We start with the report from Matt Norlander of CBS, speaking on the Eye on College Basketball podcast, which is one of the best, not one of the best, college basketball podcast nationally. Locked On College Basketball is my personal preference. For those of you who know, I also host that show on the Locked On Podcast Network. But Norlander and Paris, they do an awesome job with Eye on College Basketball, and they were speaking about Baylor's non-conference schedule. And Norlander mentioned that Gonzaga is going to be part of it. And he said it hasn't been finalized yet. In fact, I'm going to read direct quote from what he said from the Eye on College Basketball podcast. He said, quote, "They're going to play Gonzaga barring something falling through, which won't happen. Few and Scott Drew are very, very tight," which is something that we already knew. Norlander went on. He said, "They're going to play Gonzaga in the first week of the season. Sounds like that game's location is to be determined. I think Sin City is going to be the spot for Gonzaga Baylor in the first week of the season." So at this point, again, this has not been announced. It has not been publicized by either Baylor or Gonzaga. Neither school has published their entire non-conference schedule, and neither school has indicated that this game is a guarantee or timeline or anything like that. We are going solely off what Matt Norlander said on the podcast. Norlander, for those who do not know, is a very reputable source in the college basketball industry. There is zero reason that he would make this up. There is very little reason that somebody would have lied to him about this. He did indicate that something could fall through. Obviously, that is always a reality for those of you who have been very plugged into the rumor mill this offseason. You know, there has been lots of conversation about Gonzaga potentially playing Tennessee this upcoming season, and it sounds like those talks, for whatever reason, ultimately fizzled out, and that is no longer going to be something that happens. Again, you never know. Maybe they'll add Baylor and Tennessee. That would surprise me. It's possible they'll play one of these two teams in a scrimmage situation or an exhibition style, as they've done with both these teams in the past. They had a closed door scrimmage against Baylor last year, and then they had the scrimmage game that was televised on pay-per-view. I think that was 2 years ago when they played Tennessee. So we'll see. Mark Few has a lot of close friendships in the college basketball space. Scott Drew has always been one of them. So I'm not surprised. In fact, if you've been listening to the show throughout the offseason, whenever we do talk about Gonzaga's non-conference schedule and we talk about games that might still get added to said schedule, Baylor was always a team that kind of got brought up as part of that conversation because of the previous relationship between Drew and Few, because we've seen them play each other so many times. And interestingly, as far as I know, I don't believe that these two teams have played like an actual home-and-home series or even a neutral site home and home in parentheses series. We've seen a lot of Gonzaga scheduled a lot of those, obviously UConn right now and Climate Pledge, and then at Madison Square Garden this upcoming season. We saw a 2-year home and home series with Alabama. We've seen it with a handful of other programs in recent years as well. But with Baylor, they kind of just schedule one-off games. They had the game 2 years ago at the Sanford Pentagon in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the heartbreaking 1-point loss where Gonzaga's guards just forgot to show up for that game, the 64-63 loss there. Obviously, of course, these two teams most famously played in 2021 in the national championship, another game that Gonzaga fans maybe don't want to talk too much about in this particular situation. But these are two really good teams. It's a rematch of some great matchups in years past. Gonzaga allegedly won the scrimmage game last year. We didn't see a box score or a lot of data about that game, but that's what we were told. And now we're hearing that this game is going to happen in Las Vegas, a true neutral site between Spokane and Waco, Texas, and in the first week of the season. And I think that's an interesting kind of facet of this conversation as well. For starters, we know Gonzaga is playing Arizona State on November 10th. And I'm saying that we know that because we heard it last week. We talked about it on this show exactly a week ago. And also it was officially 100% confirmed by Gonzaga in a press release. November 10th, they're taking on Bobby Hurley and Arizona State. We know Baylor plays Sam Houston State on November 12th. We know that the unofficial, but basically the official start of the college basketball season is November 4th. So with Matt Norlander indicating that this game is going to happen in the first week of the season, which is obviously broad, I think we can safely assume the game will happen November 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th. It is not going to happen on November 9th. Gonzaga is not going to play Baylor in Las Vegas and Arizona State in Spokane on back-to-back days. That would be lunacy. It's obviously not going to happen on the 11th. It is not going to happen on the 12th as Baylor has that game against Sam Houston State. Won't happen on the 13th. Maybe the 14th is when it could start to happen. I don't think Baylor would play Sam Houston State in Waco and then play Gonzaga in Vegas 2 days later. Maybe they would. At that point, you're talking about the 15th, 16th. We're no longer in the first week of the season. So if we're trusting that Matt Norlander is correct in saying this game's going to happen in the first week of the season, it's going to be the 4th through the 8th. And what I'm incredibly interested in is whether this will be Gonzaga's first game of the season, because that would be very unusual. Gonzaga typically plays one of their bye games they don't typically play a ranked team in the first game of the season. In fact, most teams don't do that. It's something that Isaac and I have talked about on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. For those of you who are longtime listeners, we appreciate you. There's not a lot of marquee non-conference basketball games early in the year, and that's starting to become even less of a thing as teams have these all new overhauled rosters in the transfer portal. And you're seeing, obviously Gonzaga's team is got a lot of continuity. Baylor has a fair amount of continuity as well. We'll talk about a bit about their roster here in a second, but you see teams like Kentucky and Arkansas and Louisville and other teams who've turned over their entire rosters. And I wouldn't want to go play a marquee top 25 team before my team has had an opportunity to gel against a bye game type opponent. But last year, Gonzaga played Yale in the first game of the season, which is not the equivalent of Baylor, but it is not a bye game either. Yale's a good basketball team. They made the NCAA tournament. They upset Auburn in the first round. And they also didn't play till the 10th, which was like 4 or 5 days after the season started. So are we going to see a similar situation where Gonzaga plays Baylor on like the 7th, but they don't schedule a game first? They don't play on the first day of the season, but they play Baylor in their first game. I don't hate Gonzaga starting the season with Baylor. Trial by fire. Throw these dudes into the ring. Let's see what Caleb Battle and Michael Ajayi and those guys can do in this new system. Let's see if the success that this team had towards the end of last year can kind of carry over into a game against a really good Baylor team. Now, Baylor, like Gonzaga last year, Baylor had to replace key pieces at the starting center and the point guard position. They bring in Jeremy Roach, a 4-year starter from Duke, an incredibly talented college basketball player who now comes to Baylor to finish out his college career. They bring in Norchad Omier, a transfer from Miami. Omier's played college basketball for 4 years, and he has averaged a double-double in all 4 seasons that he has been in college basketball. He is a very, very good rebounder, very good low-post scorer. You add him in the front court. You add Jeremy Roach in the back court. You add one of the most exciting freshmen in the entire country in VJ Edgecombe, who almost single-handedly led the Bahamas to an Olympic berth on a team that had DeAndre Ayton, that had some other NBA talent. VJ Edgecombe was the best player on that roster. He's going to be exceptional next year. If there wasn't a Cooper Flagg, he'd be the very likely best freshman of the year and one of the most exciting players in all of college basketball. So you add those 3 newcomers. You have Jaden Dunn coming back. Langston Love's coming back. They add Jalen Celestine, a transfer from Cal, who shot 44% from 3 last year. This is a fun team. This is a good team. Gonzaga's got a continuity advantage, so a very early season matchup may be in Gonzaga's favor. I'm excited to see Nembhard versus Roach. I'm excited to see Omier versus Graham Ike in the front court. I'm not sure who in the heck is going to try to guard VJ Edgecombe, but Gonzaga's got some older guys. Ajayi's older, Caleb Battle's older. Those guys are going to have their hands full with a very young but very exciting prospect in Edgecombe. This is a fun game. It's a fun matchup. We'll obviously get a finalized update at some point. Hopefully very soon we get an announcement that this game is official. It is happening. We'll find out the date. We'll find out if it truly is in Las Vegas. Maybe they're still working out some of the logistics there. I wouldn't hate it if this was Gonzaga's first game. I also wouldn't hate if they find a way to get a game on the 4th and maybe have this game on the 7th or the 8th so that they get at least one game, but they'll have an exhibition game. So it'll be fine. Even if they have an exhibition game before the Baylor game, that still sets them up to be in a good spot for this game. I'm really hoping that this is true and that this all happens and comes together, because I think this is a really good matchup to kind of get Gonzaga kind of rolling right into the season and ready to compete with the best of the best, because these are both going to be top 10 teams when that first AP poll comes out. And to see them play each other in the first week of the season, that's really, really fun here for Gonzaga fans and for Baylor fans. Well, folks, let's look at the rest of Gonzaga's non-conference schedule, because we only got 3 games left, who they might schedule, where those games might be played. We're going to get into all of that and more coming up in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about game time, because it's minor league baseball season. It's almost over. Minor league baseball season is almost over, and we only got a few more weeks to get out to the ballpark. And for me, as somebody who lives 10 minutes away from a local stadium, I love being able to make a last-minute decision to grab some tickets and head out to the park. And that's why I use Game Time, because the prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. And with their killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat feature, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And if you're somebody who worries about buying tickets from a third-party app and having them not be real, having them not scan at the gate, it's very embarrassing. Nobody wants to go through that. Game Time's ticketing coverage, your purchase is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry, and I personally love having that peace of mind. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege, and folks, you get $20 off your first purchase. 2 tickets to Hillsborough Hops games, like $25, $30. You can get them for $5, $10. Bring a friend, bring a partner, head out to the ballpark. Use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. You want to hear more about this rumored game, Gonzaga Baylor? Cam Stewart, Locked On Baylor, phenomenal job. Been on his show. He's been on my show. He's an excellent, excellent podcast host. Definitely check out Locked On Baylor if you haven't yet, or Locked On Big 12, Drake Toll. Awesome, awesome podcast host over there. Check out those 2 shows if you want some more insight into Baylor, Big 12 basketball, anything else going on in that world. All right. If you listened to last week's episode where we talked about Gonzaga adding Arizona State to the schedule, Bobby Hurley, they're playing both Hurley brothers this season. It's the first ever matchup between Gonzaga and Arizona State. You know that in the second segment of that show, we went through all of Gonzaga's non-conference schedule up to this point and talked about who they might add to the schedule. We didn't mention Baylor in that episode, but we did talk about they may have one marquee game left to add. And then the other 3 games are likely going to be of the bye game ilk. They're going to be teams that and for those of you who don't know, the term bye game is quite literally when a team pays another team to come out to their stadium and lose. That's why bye games are particularly fun when that team ends up pulling off an upset. In the football world, the most common example was when Appalachian State upset Michigan. I was like 8 to 10 years ago now. I'm dating myself, but those are the kind of fun ones. And Gonzaga they play a bunch of these every year. They bring in Alcorn State or Mississippi Valley State or Cal State Bakersfield or whomever. And they bring those teams to campus. They beat those teams. They get a tune-up in. They get to play their walk-ons. They get to play some of the bench guys, maybe play some different lineups, things like that. That's what a bye game is. All power teams do this. Gonzaga, obviously not officially a power team in the sense that they're not in a power conference, but that is typically something that they do. They fill their schedule with very elite opponents and then not so great opponents. So what I want to do now is I want to take a look at what the non-con schedule looks like, which it's the same as what it looked like when we talked about Arizona State, except the addition of this Baylor game reportedly being in the first week of the season in Las Vegas, and then take a look at, with 28 games scheduled, what we're expecting to see with those final 3 games. So here's how the non-conference schedule lines up right now. The first game we know of is this Baylor game. We don't know exactly what date it's going to be, but we know it's expected to be in the first week of the season, probably between November 4th and 8th, and expected to be in Las Vegas. Again, when we get a finalized report, we'll talk about it at that point. But let's assume that game's in there. Next up, you have Arizona State at the McCarthy Athletic Center, home and home series. Gonzaga gets the first home game this year, November 10th in Spokane. Then there's an 8-day gap before they go down to the Viejas Arena in San Diego to take on the Aztecs of San Diego State, also part of a home and home series, the return of the game last year that Gonzaga lost in Spokane. Then about 9 days after that is when the battle for Atlantis will begin. That is, of course, in the Bahamas, the Feast Week MTE for the Zags this year. We do not have official matchups for those 3 games yet, but Gonzaga will play 3 of the following teams. Arizona, potential matchup with Tommy Lloyd. Indiana, potential matchup with former Zag Umar Ballo. Louisville, Providence, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Davidson. Those are the 8 teams in that event, obviously including Gonzaga. They will play 3 of those teams. Then there's about a week gap before December 7th. That is when they will take on Mark Pope and the Kentucky Wildcats. New look roster there after John Calipari departed to Arkansas. That game is December 7th at the Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle. Exactly 1 week later, December 14th, the Zags will go to basketball Mecca at Madison Square Garden in New York, to take on the 2-time defending champion UConn Huskies and their new guard, Aiden Mahaney. Then there's a 4-day gap. They take on Nicholls State in the Kennel. That is the one bye game that we know is on Gonzaga's schedule so far. And then 10 days after that, December 28th, they take on UCLA at the Intuit Dome in LA, the first college basketball game to be played at the new Intuit Dome, which will be the home of the Los Angeles Clippers. That game again, December 28th. 2 days later, Gonzaga plays at Pepperdine, and that is what kicks off the conference slate. So 28 games known, 3 games remaining. 1 game where we're not exactly sure what date it's going to be, but we are expecting that it is going to happen. So what's left? Well, last time we had this conversation, there was 4 games left, and we said 3 of them are probably going to be bye games, and one of them is maybe a mid-level team. I think I tossed out Xavier as like an option of like a good but not great team, or it'll be a marquee game. Well, it is. It's Baylor. Baylor's a top 10 team. They're going to be ranked in the top 10, maybe even the top 5. That's a marquee as marquee gets. And with Baylor and San Diego State and Kentucky and UConn and UCLA and the battle for Atlantis and Arizona State already on the schedule, I would be surprised if the 3 remaining games on Gonzaga's schedule are anything other than bye game opponents. And I know that's not sexy. I know it's not an exciting thing to be like, ooh, who are the teams that Gonzaga is going to play that, are teams that we've never heard of or who've never beat Gonzaga or who are outside the top 300 at KenPom. And yeah, that's probably what we're looking at here. Because as of right now, looking at Gonzaga's non-conference schedule, they only have 2 home games. One of them is Arizona State on November 10th. One of them is Nicholls State on December 18th. That's it. Those are the only 2 games taking place at the McCarthy Athletic Center. Folks, I promise you that they are not going to play any less than 4 or 5 games at the Kennel before they get into conference play. They're absolutely going to play more games at the Kennel, and it is hard for them to get teams to come to Spokane and play them. This has always been a challenge for Gonzaga, and I think that the only way they're going to get these final games, especially with them already having such a astute and just talented schedule that they already have, there is no way that they're not going to add 3 pretty mediocre to bad teams onto the schedule. That's what I expect to see here. I tossed out some kind of ideas here in terms of dates that we might see these games, as well as who it won't be, who it could be. Dates, there's probably going to be one before before November 10th, depending when the Baylor game happens. If the Baylor game is November 8th, I wouldn't be surprised if Gonzaga adds a bye game opponent on the 4th or the 5th. That's still 3 games in like a 5-day span, so maybe they won't do that, but it does depend when that Baylor game is going to end up happening. I think we'll see a game between Arizona State and San Diego State, which is November 10th and November 18th, so I wouldn't be surprised to see a game get tacked on in there. And then I think you're probably going to split up the Kentucky and UConn games. Right now you have Kentucky December 7th in Seattle, and then you have UConn on December 14th in the Madison Square Garden. Now, I haven't looked at the academic calendar to know when finals are, and that is a factor. If finals week is between the 7th and the 14th, then there's probably not going to be a game added there. Maybe then they would add that game between December 18th and December 28th, which is right now the longest gap in Gonzaga's non-conference schedule. Nicholls State at home on the 18th, UCLA at the Intuit Dome on the 28th, but that's over Christmas break, and they tend to like to give the guys a longer break in that window. So maybe you get like a December 21st home game against, a bye game opponent, and that ends up being your one of your games here. But that's my kind of guess as to when those games will happen. In terms of who they'll play, who it won't be. It's not going to be any team in the top 50 at Ken Palmer-Torvik. Probably not top 75. Honestly, probably not top 100. But it's definitely not going to be a team ranked in that range. Those teams don't want to come to the McCarthy Athletic Center. And if they were going to schedule them, I think it would have already happened. It's not going to be Eastern Washington. I'd be stunned if Mark Few played Dan Munson in that situation. Likewise, it's not going to be Valparaiso. It's not going to be Northern Arizona. It's not going to be Boise State. Mark Few has been very hesitant to play his former assistant coaches, so I would be very surprised if it's any of those schools. It's not going to be a future WCC team like Seattle U or Grand Canyon, so I wouldn't expect any of those teams in particular. Who it could be, maybe you get a regional game. Maybe you get an Idaho or an Idaho State, or a Montana State, North Dakota State, those kinds of teams where there's not an obvious connection coaching staff-wise. Usually we see a few of those on the schedule. We don't have any yet, so I wouldn't be surprised if one of these games ends up being of that variety. Similarly, Gonzaga tends to play Big West teams. That's fairly consistent that they have at least one Big West school on the schedule, whether it's Bakersfield, whether it's Cal Baptist, whether it's Cal State Northridge, Cal Poly, Long Beach State, who they didn't play for a long time because of Dan Munson, but he's no longer there. So maybe that'll be a team that they can add to the schedule there, Sacramento State, et cetera, et cetera. And then SWAC teams. We've seen a lot of the SWAC teams. That's your Alcorn States, your Mississippi Valley States, your Texas Southerns, Alabama State, there's a bunch of them. Those are schools that are typically HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. They're lower budget institutions. They tend to make a lot of their money by being willing to go travel anywhere and play anybody and get, whatever paycheck those schools will pay to go bring them out to campus and lose a basketball game. That's kind of what the SWAC is notoriously known for on the men's basketball side. And so Gonzaga, I think I wouldn't be surprised to see them schedule a game or two in that kind of conference or in that range. And then it could be a non-D1. Could be a non-D1 school. Could be Eastern Oregon. They've played them the last couple of years. Could be Lewis Clark State in Idaho. They play them quite a bit. Warner Pacific, Southern Oregon. There's a lot of options here. I don't like when Gonzaga adds non-D1 programs to their official schedule. I like it better when it's an exhibition, but it's always a possibility that one of their last three games ends up being in that variety. Well, folks, Jalen Suggs, he's a candidate to get an extension from the Orlando Magic, per a reporter at Forbes. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to look at Washington State's non-conference schedule. It is out. What does it mean for them? What does it mean for the Zags? All that and more coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, closing out the show, talking a little bit Zags in the NBA, specifically one Zag in the NBA and Jalen Suggs. We'll also talk Washington State's non-con schedule. Let's start with Suggs. Report here, national NBA reporter Evan Sidery from Forbes. He tweeted this. I think it was on Tuesday, I want to say. Here's his direct tweet. Jalen Suggs is a strong candidate to receive an extension from the Magic before the October 21st deadline. Based off the current market, Suggs will likely earn $30+ million annually. Suggs is viewed as a foundational piece in Orlando alongside Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner. I am not super sold on the $30+ million annually. Based off the current market, kind of feels like a sentence that's doing a lot of heavy lifting here. And to be clear, that's not me saying that Suggs doesn't deserve a monster extension or doesn't deserve to be paid like one of the better guards in the league. All of that is true. I just think that jumping straight to he's probably going to make $30 million annually feels like Evan Sidery's particular source for this information that Jalen is a strong candidate to receive an extension, maybe coming from somebody who has a vested interest in how much money Jalen Suggs is about to make, i.e., this was told to Evan by Jalen Suggs' agent. And there's nothing wrong with that. If Jalen Suggs' agent went to a reporter and said, hey, we think we're going to get an extension done, this is something Orlando wants, something we want, we're trying to get him $30 million annually, and the reporter reported that and said, that he's likely going to earn that, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not saying that's exactly what happened. I'm just saying that most of the time you get leaks, most of the time you see a source for a reporter, they have some interest in the information being released. They are releasing it to a source to publish on social media or in an article or whatever because they want that information out there. It makes sense that somebody on Jalen's side would want a source out there indicating $30 million annually for Jalen Suggs. But there's no argument that he doesn't deserve it. I mean, this is a man who averaged career high 12.5 points per game last year. And I know 12.5 points doesn't stand out, especially not in the modern NBA. But we're talking about a guy who was all NBA defensive second team. That stands out. A guy who finished 8th in most improved player voting last year for that award. A guy who finished 10th in overall defensive player of the year voting. So the consensus is that he is a top 10 defender in the NBA, that he was one of the top 8 most improved players in the NBA last year, that he was, again, all defensive second team, kind of continues to emphasize that he's a top 10 defender in the entire league. He was selected for Team USA's select team, competed against the best of the best in those scrimmages in Las Vegas, was on a roster with Brandon Miller and Jaime Jaquez and Brandon Pajemski and Cooper Flagg from Duke, was competing against, of course, Team USA with LeBron and Steph and Durant and Anthony Edwards and Tatum and everybody that was on that roster. He also shot a career-high 39.7% from 3 last year on 5 attempts per game. Jalen Suggs has earned this. He's one of the best point-of-attack defenders in the NBA. He is elite at navigating pick and rolls. He is a phenomenal role player. And I know people don't like the phrase role player sometimes, but that is what he is. Paolo Banchero is the star for the Orlando Magic. Franz Wagner is kind of the secondary star for that team. Jalen Suggs is an elite role player in the sense that he is a great defender. He is a great three-point shooter. He can take over a game if you need him to. He is playing some great basketball right now. I would love to see him get an extension and build something really special in Orlando because they have the pieces right now to be really good in the not too distant future. Closing out the show, talking a little Washington State. Their non-conference schedule was released. We talked about BYU's schedule a few days ago. We're talking Washington State's schedule here, obviously currently in the same conference as Gonzaga, whereas BYU is no longer in that conference. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up is because as a no longer power team for Wazoo, I'm curious how much it impacted their ability to schedule. And I'm not sure if we'll ever get a full answer on that. Maybe I'll attempt to get David Riley, the new head coach of Wazoo, on the podcast and see what he has to say about it. But frankly, this isn't a particularly competitive schedule. It's better than BYU's. If you listen to that show a few days ago, wow, we went into that a little bit. We really leaned into dragging BYU for not scheduling a competitive non-conference slate. Wazoo, I think a lot of this was outside of their control. I think a lot of teams maybe weren't super excited to schedule a team that replaced their coach and lost every or almost every scholarship player from last year's team and is moving down into the WCC. Again, I think the WCC is great, but that's how other teams are viewing it, and I could see them being hesitant to schedule them. At home in Pullman, Wazoo has Portland State, Bradley, Idaho, Northern Colorado, and Missouri State. You want to talk bye games? That's a group of bye games right there. I believe the Bradley series is a home and home, but for the most part, those are just not super great opponents there. True road games, Wazoo has 2 of them in the non-conference. One of them is at Nevada. That's a good game. Nevada was a tournament team last year. Then at Washington, continuing a long-standing rivalry there, despite no longer being in the same conference. Neutral, they play Iowa in Illinois. They play Eastern Washington in Spokane. They play Fresno State in Palm Desert as part of an MTE. Then they will play either SMU or Cal Baptist in that game. I think for their sake, they kind of got to hope that they win. They beat Fresno State and that SMU beats Cal Baptist. And then that way they can play SMU so they get another power conference team on their schedule. They play Boise State in Boise as a neutral site, but not really. And then they play Northern Iowa in Vegas. This is not a great schedule, but I think it's probably about as good as they were capable of doing. Only 2 guaranteed Power 5 teams on the schedule in Iowa and Washington. Hopefully they get a chance to play SMU, who is a Power 5 team, although obviously they are just now joining the ACC. So it counts, but it's got a little bit of an asterisk next to it. However, Boise State and Nevada, very good opponents there. I don't want to drag them for not being power teams. That's unfair. Both teams that made the tournament last year, both very good Mountain West teams, playing Nevada on the road in particular. That's a nice game for David Riley and the Cougars. But I think the main kind of element of this conversation is Wazoo is one of the teams in the WCC that people think may have a chance to earn that large bid. And you always want to talk about who out of this conference could get a bid if they don't win the league. Because if Gonzaga or St. Mary's is going to win the league, the other one's probably still going to get an at-large. And then you have, is Santa Clara ever going to get one? We'll talk more about their non-conference schedule later because I really like some of the games that they have scheduled. For Wazoo, I think you have to wonder if this is the kind of schedule that puts them in a position to potentially compete for an at-large bid. And honestly, I look at it and I think probably not. I mean, I think you got to go pretty much undefeated. You got to beat Washington at Washington. You got to beat them on the road. You got to beat Boise and Nevada. If you lose any of those games, I don't think it matters that you beat up on Portland State and Northern Illinois or Northern Iowa and those kind of teams. You get in conference play, you expect you're not going to go 4-0 against Gonzaga and St. Mary's or 6-0 against those two in Santa Clara. Like, you're going to lose some games in conference play, and a 5 or 6 loss Washington State team, if they didn't pick up any marquee wins, I'm not sure that gets the deal done. So they're in an unfortunate situation. I think it's harder. I mean, I know it's harder to schedule as a mid-major team and now in the WCC as opposed to being a Pac-12 school, but I'm not sure the schedule did enough for them. And who knows, maybe Boise State and Nevada will have really good seasons and those will end up being wins that age really well for David Riley's team. But I'm not super optimistic that Wazoo's schedule puts them in a position to be an at-large team heading into their first season in conference play. Folks, that's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. I want to thank all of you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We'll be back on Friday with more fun stuff regarding the WCC. We'll still be up to date here as we get into next week, 3 days a week on the show, but don't worry, we're still going to have great content. We're still going to talk recruiting updates for the Zags, keep you up to date on what's going on the women's basketball side, the baseball side, all sorts of fun stuff as we get into late August, September, and then finally October, craziness in the kennel and the return of college basketball. Thanks again for listening, folks, and until next time, as always, go Zags.